All right, so we're going to jump into etiology, development, and pathophysiology. Another chance for you to sort of engage with classmates, but try to answer the question, what causes obesity? Okay, so despite what you may have put in the last slide, it's a really deceiving question because researchers in the UK this brought together over 1,300 or 300 different professionals. So researchers, clinicians, exercise professionals, all trying to determine or display what causes obesity. And this is called the Foresight Obesity System Map. And that's what they came up with. There are 114 different elements. So if you look at those individual boxes, they're different elements. And there are over 300 connections and 200 interconnections. So 300 total connections. And a lot of those connections are right going from box to box, not from box straight to obesity. So all of these factors, so I may have one factor that influences another factor that actually then influences obesity, or I may have factor one affects factor two, which affects factor three, and it's factor three that affects obesity, right? So obesity is this really, really complex disease. And the professionals who came up with this map said that even this map is an oversimplification. So this particular map is looking at genes involved in monogenic, oligogenic, and polygenic obesity, right? So just genetic causes of obesity. And you can see there, oh, and this is just the overlap between them, right? So you can see the number of genes that actually overlap is very low, right? Some forms of obesity, right, are associated with a ton of different genes that are not found in other forms of obesity, right? So even if we just hone in on the genetic component of obesity, it's immensely, immensely complex. What they did try to do with that foresight map is they tried to group it into different sort of genres. And so they looked at societal influences, food production, food consumption, individual psychology, individual activity, activity environment, and then biology, right? So they tried to simplify for us. But even that, right? We're looking at seven different categories of, or seven different areas that could be affecting obesity. So obesity is really, really complex, right? And even in our map here, right, I've shown that, okay, positive energy balance affects dyslipidemia, which then affects adiposopathy, which then affects obesity, right? What I don't show you is that actually insulin resistance itself could then, this arrow could go bidirectionally and say that insulin resistance also affects adiposopathy, which then affects obesity, right? So we have some bidirectional relationships, right? Even in our small little map, it's kind of complex. But in our little map, right, it does all seem to start with a positive energy balance. So we have a positive chronic energy balance. Now, energy balance refers to the balance between energy intake and energy expenditure. So over here, we have energy intake. So on this left-hand side, we have energy intake. And energy intake is composed of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Okay, so that's the calories that you consume. Now, there are micronutrients and vitamins, right? But those are not associated with calories. So we're just interested in calories that you're intaking here. Then on this other side, we have energy expenditure. And your energy expenditure, I've broken down in a little bit larger format over here. But we have exercise and NEAT. NEAT stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So non-exercise activity. So me gesticulating with my hands, right? Me standing, right? That would be non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That makes up my active energy expenditure. Then we have the thermic effect of food or the thermic effect of meals, right? And that's literally, right, when I put food in my body, it does take my body energy to break that food down into usable energy sources. And then we have my resting metabolic rate. So everything else, all of my organ function throughout the day, right? My brain has to function, my liver has to function, my kidney has to function, my eyes have to function, right? Everything requires energy. And you see that broken down here for you as well. So resting metabolic rate takes up anywhere from 40 to 80% of your daily energy intake, right? Thermic effect of meals is about 8 to 15% of your daily energy expenditure. Uh, NEAT is 5 to 30% of your daily energy expenditure, and exercise is 0 to 30%. Um, Now, you can see, right, those are pretty big ranges, right? Some people don't exercise at all, so that's not going to contribute to their energy expenditure. Some people fidget a lot during the day, right? So they might have higher percentage of their energy expenditure is related to NEAT. Some people eat really high protein diets, so they might have a greater percentage of their energy expenditure related to the breakdown of protein because the breakdown of protein requires a little bit more energy. Um, and with resting metabolic rate, right, some people's brains are consuming a lot of energy. Some people's hearts are consuming a lot of energy. Some people's livers are consuming a lot of energy, and some people's are consuming less. Okay. So we have a lot of variability in terms of our energy expenditure. And also, right, your energy intake changes. Energy balance is just what's the balance between those two. So if I intake more calories than I expend through those different sources, then I would say I'm going to gain weight. If, however, my intake is smaller than my expenditure, I'm going to lose weight. And then if my intake matches my expenditure, I'm going to maintain weight. Okay, so that's our energy balance across time. If in this positive energy balance, right, which we saw back here, right, that sort of starts this disease process map for us, um, right, energy intake is greater than energy expenditure. Now, what are then the consequences of that positive energy balance across time? So when we have it chronically, what do we see? So first we see adipocyte hypertrophy, and we do see some hyperplasia. There is a difference. Hypertrophy means that my fat cells are getting bigger. Hyperplasia means that I'm getting more fat cells. However, I will say that process typically, our number of adipocytes seems to stabilize in adolescence. So anywhere from about the age of like 14 to I think maybe 25 is as high as the range seems to go. But past that point, if you have positive chronic energy balance, you're going to increase your fat tissue by adipocyte hypertrophy, not hyperplasia. If we could medically somehow figure out a way to engage in hyperplasia as opposed to hypertrophy, hyperplasia is associated with less disease risk. Okay. The other aspect of, right, we're adding tissue is we could be adding brown tissue, beige tissue, or white tissue. White adipocyte hypertrophy is associated with increased disease risk as well. So you can see that there's just like sort of one big fat droplet here. Okay. In beige tissue, we have more fat droplets. And in brown tissue, we have lots of different fat droplets. And we actually have increased mitochondrial density in that tissue as well. Okay, so I could talk about that for a long time. Really briefly, only because it's been in social media a little bit lately. Couple of things that do seem to be associated with increased what we'd call browning. So you can have, yes, in the creation of fat tissue, you could create brown tissue or beige tissue or white tissue. You can also see white tissue convert to brown tissue or brown tissue convert to white tissue. And some things that seem to affect that are the presence of a couple of hormones, so or cytokines, so IL-6, estrogen, and thyroid hormone all seem to increase the browning of tissue, as do polyunsaturated fats and caffeine intake. So polyunsaturated fats would be things like olive oil, can increase the browning of tissue. Caffeine, so things like green tea and coffee have been associated with browning of tissue. There is some talk about cold exposure being associated with browning of tissue. So in rats, they had them exposed to 30 minutes per day, below 50 degrees cold water exposure for more than 10 days, and that did lead to browning. However, the effects of that are reversible. So um, is it really helpful? That's really up for debate, right? Because you'd have to be doing it consistently like you would be doing an exercise protocol. And if the issue is positive chronic energy balance, maybe we just exercise for those 30 minutes and we get additional benefits instead. Um, uh, yeah, I could go on about that for a while. If you have more questions, drop them in the chat and I'll come back in and answer. Um, oh, Sorry, real quick. There is some talk about cold immersion increasing caloric energy expenditure because of shivering. So you do see an increase in energy expenditure with cold exposure. What's interesting though is you also see an increase in energy intake, and the increase in energy intake is greater than the increase in energy expenditure. So you typically see there's just one study, it's listed in the slide notes for you, but that with cold exposure, you saw an increase in energy intake of 200 calories, and you saw an increase in energy expenditure of 20 calories. So you could actually be making your chronic positive energy balance worse by engaging in cold exposure on a regular basis as well. So anyway, some interesting stuff that provides some nuance maybe to some conversations you may see online. So if we have adipocyte hypertrophy, right, my adipocytes are growing in size. We also have increased lipolysis or free fatty acids. So what we see is, right, those fat cells are growing in size. So then the body says, okay, actually, no, we need to get rid of and use some of that tissue. So it's going to release them, break them down, and put them into the blood. Which then leads to, so if I have a bunch of free fatty acids in my bloodstream, uh, I'm going to also be releasing more inflammatory molecules from that fat tissue. So things like TNF alpha and IL-6, which um, which decrease lipoprotein lipase and increase hormone sensitive lipase. Now, just to give you some context, and I don't expect you to be able to go into this much detail in your midterms, but this is part of your midterm conversation is the etiology of disease. So you do need to understand sort of basically what's happening. But normally in response to insulin, right? So I eat food, my body knows I ate food, it starts to produce insulin and say, hey, let's break down that food and let's start to store some of those calories or utilize those calories. That's what insulin does. That typically is associated with an increase in lipoprotein lipase. And what that does is it encourages the cells to take up those free fatty acids and store them, and a decrease in hormone sensitive lipase, which hormone sensitive lipase would say, actually, no, we need to be breaking down fat tissue. Okay. So you can see how the reverse of that, a decrease in lipoprotein lipase is saying, hey, don't pull free fatty acids from the bloodstream. And also an increase in HSL is saying, break down the fat that we already have because we've stored too much. Okay. So all of that's going to lead to a bunch of free fatty acids in the blood, as well as some inflammatory markers like TNF alpha and IL-6. So if we see that chronically, right, we've got this chronic high levels of free fatty acids in the blood, then we're going to start storing those free fatty acids somewhere. And it's not going to be in fat tissue. So where do we store it? Well, we store it in other organs where it's not supposed to be. And we call that ectopic fat storage or visceral fat storage, which results in lipotoxicity and hypoxia. So when when fat is stored where it's not supposed to be, we actually start to see tissue death. Because our blood vessels are not designed to weave in and around these large accumulations of fat, particularly in places where they're not supposed to be. So we have increases in fat storage in the pancreas, the heart, skeletal muscle, and the liver. The liver one is really interesting, and I only bring it up because it does contribute to our type 2 diabetes conversation later in the semester. But you have this ApoB molecule, ApoB protein that's produced in the liver in response to ectopic fat storage in the liver, which results in larger VLDL. So they get about 20% larger as a result of this ApoB production, which then results in smaller LDLs, which further increases atherosclerosis, right? If you remember back on our, oh, I'm not going to go all the way back there, but back on our uh, development map, right? Atherosclerosis is contributing to that cardiovascular disease. You also see less HDL being produced by the liver. You see gluconeogenesis. So the liver is actually producing more blood glucose, and then that blood glucose is going into or that glucose is going into the bloodstream, which is increasing hyperglycemia, and that is diagnostic criteria for type 2 diabetes. Okay, so I just wanted you to see these processes are all really connected. But if we come back to the ectopic fat storage, right, fat where it's not supposed to be, we run into an immune response and we run into leptin resistance. So normally fat cells, if we have a lot of fat cells, they secrete leptin, which indicate, hey, you're full. You don't need to be consuming more calories. We have enough. But if we have this ectopic fat storage, it impairs that signaling. And we have these inflammatory molecules which also impair that signaling, meaning that the body's not then going to respond normally to leptin. It's not going to feel as satiated, right? So that really impacts our satiety, our sense of fullness. You also have an immune response and impaired mitochondrial function, which affects our energy balance as well, right? We talked about even up here, right? Our mitochondrial density increases energy expenditure. So we're actually decreasing energy expenditure with that impaired mitochondrial function as well. Oh, there's supposed to be a list of molecules here for you. So that immune response leads to increases in TNF alpha, IL-6, and CRP, which is C-reactive protein, which are all inflammatory molecules. So, by the way, when people talk about inflammation online, most of them don't actually know what they're talking about. Those are all markers of increased inflammation in the body. So if someone's saying, oh, well, you're going to see increased inflammation, ask them if they know what C-reactive protein is. And if they don't, they probably don't understand what they're saying or have any context for it. The other molecule that's supposed to be in this little box here for you is adiponectin, which decreases inflammation. So the immune response and the impaired mitochondrial function actually cause a decrease in adiponectin, right? So we're not having that anti-inflammatory response, and it causes an increase in TNF alpha, IL-6, and CRP. So we've got all of these inflammatory molecules, which can contribute to the development of insulin resistance. So there's some argument on that, and we'll get into it when we talk about type 2 diabetes. But the idea is that these inflammatory molecules can actually damage receptors on our cells, and that prevents them from responding to insulin uh, appropriately. Okay, that was a beast of a slide. Feel free to pause and take a little break if you need to. But that does nicely bring us into this idea, right? So we started with that positive chronic energy balance over here, right? Um, but then we got into like, okay, wait, now we're in the blood, now we're in the liver, now we're all over the body. Okay. And that is, so there are metabolic considerations with positive chronic energy balance that may be independent of weight. So metabolic syndrome was sort of our answer to that. And we said, okay, what if it's not weight that's the issue, right? We also talked about waist circumference earlier, right? So what if it's visceral adiposity? What if it's that we're storing fat in these unhealthy locations and not necessarily weight specific? What if it's insulin resistance, right? What if it's hypertension, high blood pressure, or what if it's dyslipidemia, right? Which is a combination of sort of high triglycerides, low HDL. Okay. So we have all these things that are actually independent of weight status. And this led us to metabolically healthy obese populations. So theoretically, you could have someone who is obese, right? A BMI of greater than 30, but no dyslipidemia, no hypertension, and no insulin resistance. Okay. So, and for a minute, right, we found this population and we sort of thought, whoa, like, so what do we do with the metabolically healthy obese population? When we examine a metabolically healthy obese population, and we compare them to a normal weight metabolically healthy population, we do still see an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So 49% increased risk of coronary heart disease, 7% increased risk of stroke or cerebrovascular disease, and a 90% increased risk of heart failure. So even if you're metabolically healthy, being obese is still carries risks. But how common is that, right? So is it normal? Is it normal for people to be obese and metabolically healthy? And this study tried to answer that. And it separated things by essentially by continent, by geographic area, let's say. And what they found is that about 37% of individuals with obesity in Southeast Asia were metabolically healthy obese. In the Middle East, that's 23%. North America, that's 43%. Europe, 26%. Africa, only one study in each of these, but 86%. Australia, 38%. South America, 71%. And overall, of all individuals diagnosed with obesity, about 35% of those individuals are metabolically healthy obese individuals. But then the question also becomes, so what are the chances that they develop metabolically unhealthy obesity? So maybe you're a metabolically healthy obese individual, you're part of that 35%, but what are your chances of developing then metabolically unhealthy obesity, which would then contribute to further risk, right? And what I found is that your risk is about 49 or the incidence of individuals who have been diagnosed with obesity but have no increased metabolic markers, the chances that they are going to become metabolically unhealthy is about 49%. Okay. So really high likelihood, and this was following 5,000 individuals for 3 to 10 years. So your chances of developing metabolically unhealthy obesity go up also if you are a metabolically healthy obese individual. This is a fantastic slide that I would love you to pause and spend a little bit of time on because it really teases apart. So this is all related to cardiovascular disease, and I think we do come back to it when we talk about cardiovascular disease, but it's so interesting. So I hope you'll take some time here. But let me orient you just with this first one. So we're looking at coronary heart disease, and they split people up by their weight status, right? So this is BMI, and then the number of metabolic abnormalities they had. So if you go back to that metabolic syndrome slide, right? They had to have then measured their visceral fat, right? Their insulin resistance, their HDL, their triglycerides, right? So, and we're saying, okay, how many of those issues did they have? Um, the reference group being normal weight with zero metabolic abnormalities. So compared to a normal weight individual, an underweight individual, no increased risk for coronary heart disease if they don't have metabolic abnormalities. If they have one metabolic abnormality, right, I come over here, I draw a line down. I'm looking at a hazard ratio of maybe 1.5. So 50% increased risk of coronary heart disease if you have one metabolic abnormality and you're underweight. Then I compare a normal weight with zero metabolic abnormalities to one metabolic abnormality. Huge increase in risk here, right? Now we're jumping up to like 70% increased in risk for coronary heart disease. If we jump down to overweight individuals have also an increased risk, even with zero metabolic abnormalities. So this is where we were talking about, right? There are other health outcomes besides mortality that we're interested in, and being overweight does increase your risk for a variety of other health outcomes, even if it doesn't increase your risk for mortality directly. You can see also metabolically normal obese individuals, right? Still increased risk for coronary heart disease. Okay, but I want you to see if you can tease out, okay, well, what's the pattern then across the number of metabolic abnormalities? And does the number of metabolic abnormalities matter more than weight status does or less than weight status does? Okay, and you can look at that for 4 different diseases. So I would love for you to have some discussion around this figure. I think it's a fantastic figure. So to summarize sort of this first portion of the lecture, prevalence for obesity is 33 to 43% depending on the estimate in the US. There's been about a 30% increase in that over recent decades, and the distribution does vary by time, right? So across decades, by place, we looked at geography as in the US as well as across different countries, and by demographics. So we did see that that varies, especially by race in the US. Um, the cost is about $172 billion per year in healthcare costs. Body composition does matter, so visceral fat and especially waist circumference has a clinical impact, has greater clinical impact than BMI alone. Now, BMI may be capturing some of that, but if we control for BMI, it looks like waist circumference is the more important, could be the more important biomarker. Um, that BMI and visceral fat drive dyslipidemia, hypertension, and insulin resistance. Metabolically healthy obesity is possible, but cardiovascular disease risk still increases for those individuals. How obesity develops is really complex, but weight gain does require a positive energy balance. Um, and that process is really complex. Um, For the pathophysiology, you should understand that chronic positive energy balance leads to fat cell hypertrophy, particularly white adipocyte hypertrophy, which increases lipolysis, right? The breakdown of that fat storage, which causes lots of free fatty acids in the blood and causes inflammation, which leads to ectopic fat storage, so storing fat where it's not supposed to be, which contributes to leptin and insulin resistance. Okay, you should be familiar with that, and you should be able to sort of follow that diagram in your mind, how things develop. All right, another little break for you.